La o nouă seară Nautilus, în care o să avem un interviu live cu scriitorul Lev Grossman. Sigur, se numesc Serile Nautilus, dar iată că am ales de această dată un autor din seria Ungathered, dar dacă ați citit deja cărțile sau dacă ați citit despre ele, știți că sunt niște cărți cu un puternic, foarte puternic film fantasy, care, într-adevăr, în care protagonistul, într-adevăr, începe cumva o adolescență întârziată de pe la 18 ani și spre finalul volumului al treilea deja are 30 de ani după ce trece prin foarte, foarte multe lucruri și cred eu că se maturizează destul. Știu că locul meu trebuia să fie Ana Nicolau. Din păcate, din motive obiective, nu a putut să ajungă, așa că voi locui în seara asta. Sunt Alexandra Florescu. De dinainte să iasă pe piață primul volum, Magicienii, o parte a jobului meu a fost, bineînțeles, să fac mult research și să citesc despre cărți și despre autor. Pot să vă spun, dacă nu știți deja, că e un personaj extrem de interesant, extrem de un background academic literar foarte, foarte interesant, care scrie despre autori contemporani și în jurul acestor cărți s-au iscat o mulțime de dezbateri și de discuții foarte interesante apropo de ce înseamnă să scrii o carte fantasy după ce deja s-au scris niște cărți colosale, ce înseamnă să te apropii cumva de teme despre care au scris autori foarte mari. Lucruri pe care le-a comentat îndelung în foarte multe interviuri, într-un mod convingător, cred eu, și sper că dacă nu ai citit până acum să le citiți după ce l-auziți pe autorul vorbind. O să mă aștept fără să mă vadă. Să vedem. Deci, cred că i-am zis că intrăm pe la și 10, așa că poate să mai stăm un pic. Aveți o întrebare pe care ați vrea să îi adresez autorului? Dacă citi cărțile? Da, trebuie să mai stăm un pic. A citit cineva toate 3 cărțile? Și? Bănuiesc că ați venit pentru că v-au plăcut.
Evident.
Da, autorul ați mai văzut în interviuri până acum sau ați citit interviuri cu el?
Da.
Serial? Serial a văzut cineva? Și cum e față de carte?
E ok, în linii mari cam aceeași poveste, dar în serial mi s-a părut mai dinamic și se concentrează cumva pe mai multe personaje în același timp, pentru că primul volum e doar despre personajul principal, în serial vin și povestile celorlalți. Am citit doar primul volum, așa că doar din punctul să vedem pot să
Da, în primul volum avem dat perspectiva lui Quentin, în volumul al doilea se adaugă și Julia și în volumul al treilea se trece la vreo 5 personaje, dacă nu mă înșel, și un al 6-lea care lasă o scrisoare, așa că se... Și în serial, într-adevăr, au avut grijă să preia fire narrative și din cartea a doua și a treia, tocmai că să fie mai plin de plot și de întâmplări. Din câte am citit și eu, și din câte poate să ne spună și el, este creative consultant, dar nu scrie el scenariu. El spune că e foarte mulțumit de cum sunt dezvoltate personajele în serial. Și sperăm să facă și sezonul 3 în 2018. Din câte știu, nici am citit în interviurile recente, pregătește o nouă carte, dar sper că o să ne spună el despre ce vorbim astăzi mai multe. Deci nu aveți nicio întrebare pentru el? Ceva ce, nu știu, ați rămas cu o dilemă din cărți și vreți să vă dezvăluie? Dacă vă vine vreo idee, nu știu, scrieți pe un bilețel și îmi dați și ne întrebăm. Încercăm. Până acum am vorbit de 2 ori cu el și trebuie să recunosc că e de o punctualitate înspăimântătoare și dacă i-am zis la și 10, nu cred că o să-mi plecăm la și 10, deci... Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
So we are at a bookshop in Bucharest. Unfortunately, I cannot show you the audience, but some of your readers are here, somewhere in front of me. I'm sorry you cannot see them. Maybe I'll send you some photos. I have here the second edition of your book, the first novel, Magicians. I don't know if you saw the cover until now.
I have seen it. They sent me a copy.
Great. Okay, so I would like to start with a few, let's say, more general questions, and then ask 2 questions regarding the books themselves, the trilogy. So just a short reminder for the audience, you have a really strong academic background. So you have a degree in literature, you followed a PhD in a PhD program in comparative literature, and you actually write extensively on contemporary fiction. Am I correct? Yes. So the question is, how does that literary academic background shape your writing in terms of style, of narrative, of themes?
It's a very important part of my writing. Although for a very long time it was a bit of a problem for me. I didn't write The Magicians. I didn't start writing The Magicians until I was 35, and I had been trying to write for 15 years at that point. I have a very elaborate education, as did both of my parents. Both of my parents were English professors. And for a very long time, I tried to write like James Joyce. And I tried to write like Virginia Woolf. And for a lot of different reasons, I couldn't make it work.
Well, that's tough. You chose 2 tough writers.
Yes, apart from the fact that I'm not a genius, I couldn't say what I wanted to say using that kind of voice. And it was almost out of desperation that I started over, and I started writing in a genre that in some ways isn't considered respectable in the academic world. Nobody at Harvard or Yale, and certainly not my parents, studied C.S. Lewis, the Narnia books, or Philip Pullman, or Harry Potter. But I had an instinct that maybe if I couldn't write in a respectable way, I would write in a disgracefully bad way and see what came out. And as soon as I started writing fantasy, this story about the education of a wizard, I began to realize that something was getting onto the page that I couldn't write any other way. And it's not standard fantasy. I think if anything, the thing that makes The Magicians books different, maybe from other fantasy novels, is they have a lot of influences from other books that aren't fantasy, from literary books, from the modernists, from the greats, and somehow all those combined to produce The Magicians. But for a long time, I had to unlearn a lot of that stuff that I'd learned, and then figure out exactly how to use it, which wasn't obvious at first.
In an interview, you actually said that when you started writing fantasy, it felt unbelievably freeing, if I'm correct. Can you elaborate on that a bit for us, because it sounds really, really inspiring?
Yes, I can elaborate on it. I may give you more personal information than you really want in my answer. When I was 35, I was approaching middle age. I just had a child, and
we lost you a bit.
I was desperate to try to say something on paper, and I started thinking about the books that were truly important to me, and coming back to was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is the first in the this series about Narnia by C.S. Lewis, a book for children. And I started to wonder, I found that book so compelling, absorbing. Could I write a story like that? A story about a young person who was discovering that they had power that they didn't know they had, or finding their way into a secret place that no one else knew about. Could I tell a story like that, but tell it for adults? And put in all that stuff that I wanted to say about my life and things that I was experiencing as an adult. And that was sort of the experiment that I tried with the magicians. And it was incredibly liberating. I think partly because I knew that my parents would hate it. My parents, there's a point in your life when you have to go, you have to leave home and go somewhere your parents have never been. And for me, that was a metaphorical thing. Writing fantasy, my parents, they weren't interested. They thought it was silly and unimportant. For me to write in that mode, in that way, it was very liberating. And I think, in part, simply because it was forbidden and it was considered unimportant by my parents. I thought, I'll own this. This will be mine and nobody else's. And it was very, very energizing.
Well, thank you so much for sharing so much with us. You also write a lot about technology. Why not choose science fiction? Weren't you ever attracted to science fiction rather than fantasy?
This is a really important question for me because I did want to write science fiction, and I tried many times to do it, and I couldn't. And I thought it was very strange. I didn't understand why I was attracted to fantasy. And I didn't come up with an answer to this question until long after I finished. In a way, fantasy is very much about technology. And in the sense that it's about a world where you take away technology. You subtract technology from the landscape. And you see what's left. C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, these writers who really created the modern fantasy novel, they wrote it at a time of a real technological revolution, when cities were first becoming electrified, cars were replacing horses, World War I had just happened, mechanized warfare was starting, mass media, television and radio. They couldn't tolerate it, and they wanted to imagine a world where none of that stuff was. Take it all away. And that's how you get fantasy. You replace it with magic. And it's a way of thinking about, well, what do we lose? What does technology take away from us? It gives us many things. If we subtract it, then we start to understand things about what we lose when we let technology into our lives, what we lose when we let it take over the landscape and mediate our conversations with our friends and our relatives. What if you get rid of all that? What have you lost, but then what have you gained? So for me, fantasy is very much a way of thinking about technology, but indirectly, by taking it away and making it at the space it's left on.
That's very interesting. I had a question later on about magic, about the magic you have in your books, but I think I'll get it in right now because it fits. So as much as character arcs and world building are important for narrative, as important I think is the type of magic you choose to give to your character and to your world, because it holds the story together. And your particular kind of magic is a bit dangerous. It requires a sort of intellectual rigor. At some point you even translate it in the book in a sort of hacker language. But I think it's very interesting because it seems more real somehow, more relatable, but it's not boring. It's not sciencey boring. So how did you come to this type of particular magic? How did you, I don't know, imagine it? From which pieces?
Well, it's a big problem writing about magic. If you look at the kind of magic people, wrote about 100 years ago, they didn't explain anything. You look at Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, or the magic in Narnia. Nobody went to magic school in those books. They just have magic. They got it from somewhere. And you don't know the rules. You don't know where it comes from or how they learned it. Some people can do it, some people can't, but you don't know why. People they won't stand for that anymore. They don't believe it. They want to know much more about magic. They want to know the rules. They want to know the training. They want it to be a system. So when I went about sort of thinking about how I wanted magic to work, the most important thing for me was that it feel real. And it had to feel orderly enough that you could teach it in a school, like in Harry Potter. But it had to feel wild enough that it wasn't completely predictable. It didn't just feel like technology. It felt like some natural phenomenon, like a lightning storm. So it's you have to walk a real line. I learned a lot from Ursula Le Guin, who made a magic system sort of that looks like a language a little bit. Languages, they obey some rules, and then at the same time, there's a lot of exceptions. They're sort of both organic and, in a way, technological or engineered. I wanted that quality for magic. And I wanted to feel very physical. I love Harry Potter. I'm a big fan. But I never felt as though I really understood what it feels like to cast a spell. What exactly you're doing with your hands and your wand when you're waving it around. I wanted to be very specific. I wanted to think about how would a writer like Hemingway, or Joyce, or Woolf, how would they describe magic? I wanted to be very specific about what you're doing with your hands, what kind of words you're saying, what it feels like. Do your fingers feel hot when you're doing magic? To leave the smell in the air afterwards. I wanted to feel very concrete, so that even though we've never seen magic done, it would feel as if it was real, and you were seeing it done right there in the room.
Okay, that's very detailed. Thank you. So what I came up with a lot during my research about your books and about yourself was a huge discussion about the literary influences in your book. And you very gracefully dealt with it at some point by referring to Harold Bloom and his theory about the creative anxiety of poets who need to rebel against the major works before them. So I wanted you to elaborate, if you can, about how you dealt with the major, how you chose to integrate them in your books, making an homage to them or translating them in your trilogy.
It's an important issue especially for fantasy writers, because fantasy novels, they tend to share a lot of DNA. You're inheriting a lot from the writers who came before you. No one invents magic. No one invents dragons or swords or any of that stuff. So when you write fantasy, you're very aware that there's a lot of influence going on. You're taking a lot from people who came before you, and you have to make it your own in some way. I have always been interested in books that explicitly rewrite other books. I'm very fond of Why Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, which is a retelling of Wuthering Heights, from a different point of view. Or Rosencrantz, Guildenstern are Dead, which takes these minor characters in Hamlet and retells the whole story of Hamlet from another point of view. I really enjoyed that. And I wanted to, I couldn't quite do that because copyright laws in America are too strict. You can't take the characters from Narnia and play with them. But when I sat down to write Magicians, I was very constantly thinking, what if this were a letter I was writing to C.S. Lewis or J.K. Rowling? I wanted to specifically speak back to them and say, I love your work. It's very much shaped my life and how I understand my experiences. But in some ways, you got it wrong. Or there's parts of my life that aren't covered in your books. I want to explain to you how I want to take what you wrote and change it so that it brings the stuff in that you left out. And it was very much, in this book, Bloom describes it as an edible struggle, as you're having a fight with your parents. You're killing off your literary father, slash literary mother, I guess. And it's a bit like that to me. You know how you feel with your parents. You love them and you hate them at the same time. A lot of that emotion was going through these, I wrote. And again, it was very energizing. It was very energizing. It's something that I feel like is happening more and more. People are very interested in fan fiction, for example, or remixing things. This idea of taking somebody else, not pretending it's original, not pretending like you invented this whole new kind of story, because there are no new kinds of stories. So why pretend? When we write, I feel like everybody's taking something and rearranging it and then passing it on. I didn't want to pretend that I wasn't doing that. I wanted to be very clear about what I was doing. And this generation, I feel like, is almost more comfortable with it than my generation or my parents' generation, where there's this obsession with originality. I think this idea of taking existing stories, which is something that Shakespeare did, something that Homer did, they didn't pretend to invent these stories, they just rewrote them. I wanted to be as upfront as I could be that I wasn't writing, I was rewriting.
I think recently I saw a video essay and someone called our popular culture filled with intertextual terrorism and nostalgia terrorism, like everyone is remaking things, remixing and so on, which is I think pretty cool for nerds and for people who read a lot of comic books and watch a lot of movies and read fantasy and so on.
It's very old. I mean, if you look at when people thought about authorship in the medieval period, this idea that you were creating something from nothing, it was a little bit blasphemous. God created something from nothing, and the rest of us are just working with what we find. This idea that authors, they don't invent things, they take a story, they are the temporary caretaker of it, and then they pass it to somebody else. It's a very old idea. This idea that that we have to be original, and when you write something, it's your intellectual property, you own it, nobody else can touch it. It's sort of an 18th century idea, and I think it's had a good run, but I sort of think it's maybe on the way out.
Probably, we'll see. While I was doing my research, I was honestly overwhelmed by the many reactions to your books, and I'm not only referring to reviews saying that your books were brilliant or good or bad. I'm referring to the debates they arose, meaning the debates about fantasy, what are you supposed to write, the debates concerning your protagonist, Quentin. Why is he depressed? Some people were upset that he was such a bad person. Some people were inspired by the fact that you tackled with depression and anxiety. There was a discussion about how you treat your female characters in your books. But anyway, the reactions were very passionate, and I think that's a compliment for any writer. So coming to my question is, how do you relate to all those reviews and reactions, being a reviewer yourself, and did they shape in any way how you wrote your second and third novel after the first reactions?
I may deny this later, but they did have a very big effect on me. I'm a professional critic, so I know where reviews come from and what exactly they're worth. So you would think that I wouldn't pay too much attention to them. But as a matter of fact, I'm very thin-skinned. And whenever anybody criticized my books, I would get very, very defensive about it. But after a while, I started to listen to these voices because the books are very polarized. When you look at Goodreads or Amazon, there's a lot of 5-star, and there's plenty of 1-star reviews as well. People kind of love them or hate them, which is interesting to me. Quentin is a big sticking point for a lot of people. Some people love him, some people hate him, some people love the books in spite of him. The Magicians is a coming-of-age story. And I was aware when I wrote it that, when you have a 17-year-old, maybe especially a 17-year-old boy, who has not come of age, is emotionally very young for his age, it's quite immature, they're not always very pleasant to be around. Harry Potter, very charming. The 70 children in Narnia, they're very charming. Lyra in the Holmes books. Kids who haven't come of age, or who are struggling to come of age, they're not always very charming. When they have a lot of growing up to do, it's kind of obvious because they have personality problems. Quentin is like that. Quentin is somebody who has not grown up, and it's time for him to grow up. But in the meantime, before he has grown up, he's a pain in the ass. And he does suffer from depression. I think fantasy is very much about depression. I think a lot of depressed people read fantasy as a way to escape or have fantasies of power. And I thought, well, who would go to fantasy school in real life? I think a lot of depressed people would show up there because they feel as though the world around them, it's disenchanted. There's no magic in my life. Nothing means anything. And this is something I struggled with in my own life. They're looking for something more than reality can give them. In real life, there isn't anything. We're going to learn to cope with reality. But there's a powerful myth about people discovering that there is more, that there's a new place to go, or there's a whole magical energy that's all around you, but nobody sees it with you. This idea of working through depression, through fantasy, and through magic, it was very important, but it's not for everybody, and it results in, and the characters are not necessarily as likable as traditional fantasy characters. I will say that after The Magicians came out, it's funny, when your book is being prepared for publication, and it's being edited, and your friends are reading it, your spouse is reading it, your editor's reading it, nobody can tell you that. Nobody will tell you that. So I was surprised when people had so many negative reactions to Quentin. I didn't see that coming. And when I went to write the second book, I did think, I'm going to start making it easier for people. As Quentin grows up, I think it's fair for him to become more likable. And that's what happens through the second book. And by the end of the third book, he's almost tolerable. He reaches that point where you could almost imagine having lunch with him.
You think he's tolerable?
Yeah. Then he's done. The end of Hero's journey.
I was very curious about how you worked with your editor or editors, not only in terms of how you pitched the first book, let's say, but even how you worked on the text for the first, or maybe more so for the second and the third. Did you work on the text precisely with them, correct things, or were you more free?
It was an interesting experience. When I went to, this is a little bit sort of behind the scenes, but when you finish writing your novel, then you go out and see if you can find somebody who will publish it. And The Magicians could very easily have been published by a fantasy publisher. And who would have, I think, probably emphasized the fantasy elements. Because I think in part, I am who I am, and I have a literary background, I didn't go to fantasy publishers. I went to literary publishers. I went to Viking, an American publisher that had never published a fantasy novel. And they bought it, thank goodness, but they weren't interested in the fantasy part at all. They said, that's your business. We just want to talk about the characters and the relationships and the style, and we're going to work on that. And we need it to function as a novel. Even if there was, if you deleted all the magic stuff, we wanted it to still be a novel that we would read. So it got produced and edited as a literary novel, which was, I think, very good for it. I was surprised that they took it on in a way, because it is, to me, a fantasy novel. That's how I think of it primarily, even though it sort of gets shelved in either part of the bookstore. So it got produced as a literary novel, and that had a big influence on how I wrote it. It was also supposed to be one novel. There weren't going to be any novels that came after it. And when I got to the end and the book was published, I was very happy with it by itself. But my mother called me and she said, "Well, I finally read your fantasy, but I don't understand the ending." And I said, "What? What is there to understand? It's completely clear." But we had such a big argument about it that I realized I had to go back and write another one, just to make clear to my mother what had happened in this one.
Wow, that's such a Freudian statement. I like it.
I know, you could just do anything like that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing again. So, going back a bit to the slight unlikability factor of your characters and to the trends in our popular culture, you stated more than once that you were very inspired by the Watchmen comic book, and I believe now we're in a post-Watchmen era in which classic heroes are always challenged, they're always on the brink of becoming the villains themselves, and your characters as well are not always, they're not really villains, but not necessarily the heroes in the story. So what do you think this brings to the table, this particular viewpoint on heroes and characters? Why is it more appealing to make them slightly villains for the audiences? Why did you choose to do it that way?
Well, it was an important thing to me. Fantasy novels, fantasy as a genre is very concerned with this question of good and evil, and who is the hero and who the villain is. When you read Tolkien, it's very obvious who the heroes and villains are. Often the villains, they look different. They look like them. You would never mistake them for heroes. They're ugly, or something else about them tips you off. And even something as modern as Harry Potter, it still has that figure in it, the embodiment of ultimate evil. It still has the Voldemort, who is obviously a big problem for Harry, but he has a very organizing influence on Harry's universe. Everything is quite neatly laid out. You know exactly who is good and who is evil, except for Snape, which is a bit confusing. And Harry knows what his job is. When he gets up in the morning, he will use his magic to try to defeat evil. My life, I love Harry Potter, but my life is very different from that. I don't know anybody who's the embodiment of absolutely ultimate evil. I never met anybody like that. And the question of good and evil is very confusing to me. I don't know if I'm good or evil. When I do something, I don't know if it's going to be the right thing or the wrong thing. And no one ever tells me afterwards. Or if they do, they always disagree with each other, whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing. Everything is shades of gray. And when you try to put that into a fantasy novel, when you try to subtract that of the Voldemort figure, it changes everything. And it becomes much less a story about using magic to defeat evil, and much more a story about people just trying to figure out, what is magic for? Why do I have this power? And what can I do with it? That's the story that the characters in The Magicians live. They're just trying to figure out what all this magic's for.
I'll ask a question concerning more your style of writing and your choice of narrative perspectives. So your first novel begins with third-person perspective, Quentin. The second one, you add Julia, so you have two perspectives, and then you have, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 5 in the third one. So I'm wondering if that came organically because the story got more and more complex and you needed more aware of your writing potential and you wanted to write more complexly?
Well, it's a bit of both. There's no question that I began to feel more confident as the writing process went on. And in the first book, I really don't think I did have the confidence to write from, for example, a woman's point of view, or just the point of view of anybody whose experience is different from mine, a gay man's point of view. I didn't believe that I could do it in an incredible way. There's one chapter in Ambitions where it's from Quentin's point of view, but it's mostly a woman telling a story, Janet telling a story. And I remembered that I loved writing that. It came very easily to me. And so I wanted to have a chapter like that in the second book. And when I began to write from Julia's point of view, I loved it so much. I became like a sort of literary drag queen. I was so excited by it, putting on this female persona. It felt so natural that the whole Julia story exploded. It's meant to only be a little bit of the second book, but it became about half of the second book. So it was a matter of confidence, and it was also a matter of, in a way, Quentin's process of growing up. You know, in the first novel, you're really trapped in his head. You've got nowhere to go. You're stuck in his head. You're stuck looking out through his eyes. Basically, it's third person, but it's very close to his point of view. I think Quentin becomes more empathic as the series goes along. Other people become more real to him. As he's growing up, he realizes that other people he's not the center of the world. Other people have very different experiences and emotions. And in a funny way, that's reflected by the way that the point of views fragment in the book. Suddenly it becomes the space of the book becomes space where there can be lots of different people and lots of different points of view. And then by the third, it jumps around quite a bit. And we see people really sharing the stage. Quentin doesn't monopolize. It's not a big monologue from Quentin. He can step aside and let other people take over the story. And that was both form and content. It's what the books are about. And then it was also me becoming more confident formally.
So a little bit of both. Your characters growing and you growing with them.
I think that's probably it. Yeah. It's strange when you're a novelist. Novels take so long to write. The Magicians took me 5 years to write. The second one took me 2 years. The third one took me 3 years. So it was 10 years between the beginning and the end. I was a very different person by the end of. By the time I finished writing them. A lot of stuff happened to me. I had 3 children. I was a very different person from when I started. And the books changed. The books kind of changed along with me.
That's great. That's how it's supposed to be, I think.
I think so too.
You have really taken the readers to some dark and very dark places with some of your characters. I don't want to give anything up precisely for the audience, but especially Julia goes through some very violent and hurtful events. And I know you said at some point that not writing about the hardships of a person means actually a lack of integrity for a writer. I love that a lot. So I wanted to ask you how you managed to go to those dark places and to write such things about the characters you created, cherished, and nourished throughout the books.
You're asking me about something that I still haven't resolved my feelings about. It was important to me to touch on dark things in the books. I don't think of myself as somebody who likes horror. I don't really read horror either. But the fantasy tips over into horror at certain points in the books. And it's me attempting to put powerful, extreme emotions on the page. That experience of being devastated or traumatized is very much about what it is to be human. To go through something that you feel like you're not going to survive, and then survive it. And you discover things in yourself that you didn't know were there, things that were unbreakable. It's a very human thing. I think everybody, even if they haven't gone through an explicitly traumatic event, has experienced some of that. And there's the question of sexual violence, which occurs in the books, which I felt very ambivalent about. I wanted to write around it, and then I felt as though, as you said, there was a lack of integrity involved in my leaving it out. I wanted to honor this experience, which many people have, as the terrible traumatic thing it is. I wonder to this day, there are some people who feel as though they were very helped by those scenes in those books and those events. And there are people who read it and say, no, I've been through something like this and it's just making it worse, having to read about it. Again, it's one of those things that nobody will say to you while you're writing the book. I showed it to many, many people, those books. Mostly women. My editor was a woman, her boss was a woman. My wife read it, those were the first few people to read it. My agent was a woman. No one ever said, dial it back. This is too much. And yet I have had readers come to me and say it was too much. And it makes me think. And they ask me, would you write it that way now? And I don't know if I would. It's very hard for me to reread those passages. And it's not like other writers don't write similar things and go to similar places. But to this day, I wonder whether I made the right choices.
Well, I guess the readers have to decide for themselves if how they experience those pages.
Yes.
You just have to own them somehow.
I know. I have to own them, and I'm not trying to distance myself from them. But I think about this question often on social. Authors now people reach out to you because you're on social media, you're on Twitter or Facebook. People reach out to me all the time to talk about how my books affected them, and it keeps me thinking about what they mean to people. So I'm still thinking about it. They made a television show out of the Magicians. I don't know if it's broadcast in Romania.
Well, it's not, but people are still watching it, don't worry.
It gets there, one way or the other.
It gets there.
I wondered if they would, sort of smooth out some of the rough edges of the books, make the hero more likable, or work around these really dark episodes that happen in the books. And they didn't at all. He's absolutely as intolerable on screen as he is in the books. And the same terrible things happen. And it's almost harder to watch them on screen than it is to read about them. So maybe they're just an integral part of the books that can't be taken out. I don't know. I still think about it.
Us too. After we read them, we have to think about them too, I guess. One of my final questions about the book is particularly about the ending of the trilogy, because you have a very strong and dramatic third act, as they call it, with the imminent apocalypse. And I wanted to ask if, again, that came organically with the story, or if it is a sort of translation of your own fear of leaving that world, of having the last page, of saying goodbye to your characters.
Yes, it's a good question. I always come back to the Narnia books because they were such an important influence. And something similar happens in the last Narnia book, which is called The Last Battle. It's a bit like the book of Revelations in the Bible. It describes an apocalypse. You discover that Narnia all along was sort of unstable, almost sort of tectonically. You think it's going to last forever, but in fact it falls apart, and they have to go somewhere else. A lot of people hate that book, or just don't even read it. No one likes it, except for me. I love it. And I felt as though, you know, again, I had to, I wanted to break the world apart, and you know, once the worst possible thing had happened, see what was left, and what the aftermath would be like, and what could survive. You know, this you know, really traumatic, destructive moment. And you're asking me a question I don't know the answer to. It always felt very, very important to me to push through that, to write that and see what, if anything, came after it. I never liked the way that it worked in C.S. Lewis in the Narnia books. When they leave Narnia, they just go to another magic land, and they say, well, this one's definitely going to last forever. And I finished the book thinking, well, it's only a matter of time before that one falls apart too, and then where are they going to go? So I felt as though this question of the stability of that magic land, that you feel like, you know, it's the wonderful place where all the problems are solved. What if it doesn't last forever? What if, like our world, it's a mortal world? I need to work that through, and it's hard for me to say precisely why. But I will say that I'm very proud of it. It's my favorite piece of writing in 3 books is the scene where everything falls apart. And I will add also that it's in the end, it's quite a happy ending. You know, things get very bad in the middle of the trilogy, but I felt that I wouldn't be satisfied until I got Hillary and all the characters to a place where, you know, they felt like they could go on, and we knew that they'd be all right. And that is eventually, after, you know, 1,300 pages, they do eventually get there.
And now they are on television, so they live on somehow. You were very honest at some point and said that you feel that movies are about better or more promoting the books they're based on. I mean, that's a very honest thing to say by an author, by a writer. After the series on sci-fi began, did you feel your fan base increased? Did you feel people were more interested in the books, or interested again? Did you feel a change?
At least in America, when you're a writer, you feel as though books are so important. They're everything. They're central to our culture and how it works. Books are tiny. They're a very, very quiet place. In America, if you sell 10,000 books in 1 week, then you are the best-selling author in the country. Maybe 15,000 if you're John Grisham. If you are on TV and 1 million people watch your TV show, you are the worst-rated show on television. If you are in America, if you get 1 million viewers, you're canceled immediately. So it's 2 orders of magnitude. It's 100 times louder when you anything that you put on TV. It's 100 times louder than a book. And you know, I want to be upfront about that. It's hard to push books out into the world and get people reading them. There's a lot of resistance, just due to the nature of how our culture works. And once you're on TV, it does the pushing for you. It does the pushing for you in a way that books can't do for themselves. I once talked to a very famous writer about this, who'd had his work adapted, and I was feeling really guilty and strange about it. And he said, just embrace it. Let Hollywood work for you. You know, let them do that thing that you can't do for yourself. And it's true. Many new people found the books once they were on TV, and you feel as though you're sort of hitching a ride on some other cultural force. You're sort of surfing on it and using it to get where you want to go. And it's a great thing. It's a wonderful thing to happen to the book. It should happen to every book. All books should be on TV.
Well, then there will be too many and none of them will be as successful as they should, probably. But yeah, in publishing houses, we are very much aware that having a movie or a series after a book is actually very important for the audience. I don't know if that is fortunate or not, but that is the world we're living in right now. So we are very much aware. Did you, I mean, after the book became a TV series, did you feel that somehow your writing changed? Did you become more, I don't know, aware that maybe your next book will also be made into a movie? Trying to write more cinematic, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm trying to think what the truly honest answer is. You know, it's. I hope my agent isn't watching this, because it didn't really change things. It didn't change things. That, you know, the business of thinking in a visual way, of making pictures, it's so different from creating words. And, you know, in the end, my brain works in words. It doesn't work in pictures very well at all. I don't see movies when I'm writing. And I think, you know, I'm working on something now. It would be very helpful if somebody made a big movie out of it or a TV series. But I'm just powerless. I would like to suck up to Hollywood and pander to them, give them what they want, but I can't do it. I don't know how to do it as a writer. You know, I'm going to write this thing, and they'll just have to find whatever they want in it. When there's a scene in Magicians that's set in Antarctica, and when the producers came to me and said, "Does it have to be Antarctica? It's so expensive. I mean, how do we have to build the whole Antarctica in the show? You know, can't we just have it in, you know, have it in Canada?" You know, I don't think about these things. These are problems for other people to solve. Everything starts with words to me, and it's up to somebody else to turn them into pictures. I can't do it.
Well, that's a fair answer, but I think you just opened the Pandora box and said something about writing on a new book. Are you willing to share anything about that with us? What you're working on?
I'll tell you a little bit about it. I'm not very good at pitching my own work. But the novel I'm working on, and I've been working on it for 2 years now, so it really occupies my whole brain right now. It's a story about King Arthur. It's another case of taking a story that exists in culture and rewriting it and reframing it in a different way. And the short version is, when people write about King Arthur, you know, they write about Camelot, and he pulls the sword out of the stone, and then in the end he dies. We've heard that story so many times. I decided I would write a story that begins with King Arthur's death. And I wanted to write about the chaos and the darkness that engulfed Camelot after Arthur's death. And Britain breaks apart, and all the fairies and the magical things that have been hiding come out of the woodwork. There's only a few survivors left. It's like an apocalypse. It's a sort of post-apocalyptic story. The death of Arthur was an apocalypse. And I want to write on about what lived on and how the survivors found a way to keep going once the light had gone out of the world and Camelot had collapsed.
We're looking forward to this.
Well, I hope I finish it. It's getting very long, and I'm not even half done. So it may be a couple of years.
Well, that's why you have an editor, to keep you in check, I guess. All right?
Okay. Yeah.
I have only 2 questions left. This one is slightly serious, I think, but I think you'll appreciate why I'm asking it, especially since you're living in the US. So supposedly fantasy writing is, of course, escapism, yeah, a form of escapism. But today, there's a public concern, if not panic, about how truth and language itself are being altered by politicians, news channels, social media, and so on. So in this context, is escapism really innocent anymore? And what are fantasy books meant to bring to the table other than pure entertainment? What is a storyteller to do in today's world?
Maybe not surprised. I'm going to challenge the premise of the question. I don't see fantasy as escapism. When you look at a series like Game of Thrones, for example, obviously it's set in another world, but there's a lot of truth in it that is true in our world as well. It's a book about power. It's about how people gain power, how they abuse it, both between individuals through violence, and then politically. And that is a very important thing for us to be thinking about, certainly in the United States, which feels less democratic and more like a monarchy or tyranny every day. Fantasy is a very good tool for writing about that kind of power and how it's abused. And you know, even if the people aren't real, the forces and the truths that are contained in fantasy are very real. I will add that working with language is harder than it used to be, not easier. When you deal with somebody like Donald Trump, who lies habitually, who is not eloquent, who uses words in a clumsy and violent way, that does violence to grammar and to truth, and the relationship between truth and language and truth, it's very destructive of the way language works. Every writer that I know sits and thinks, what is this man doing to the tools that we work with? And how could we write something that feels true when nothing feels true anymore? It's a big problem, and I don't know what the solution is. It's a real challenge.
Yes, it was a hard question. I didn't expect a precise answer, but you did say what I expected you to say. So my last question is actually an opportunity for you to tell me what you wish I would have asked you and I haven't, or what you're never asked and you would like to be asked more often.
Let's see. A great thing writers love to talk about other writers' books, not their own. If you'd asked me about the books that inspired the editions or that forced me to write it, I could name you 5 books that are better than editions that made me write the editions. We mentioned a couple of them. Watchmen is one. That book specifically is why I started writing the editions. When I read that book, I thought, this is exciting. This is what's happening in fiction. This blend of fantasy and the literary. That was the book that directly inspired the editions. And the last one is a book that not that many people read anymore, even in America, in the UK, and that is Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, which is a minor masterpiece of the 20th century. And if people ask me, is Braithwaite, is the school in The Magicians, is it supposed to be Hogwarts? It's not. It's supposed to be Oxford. The Oxford where Brideshead Revisited happens. The Oxford of the 19-teens and 20s. I try to make everybody read Brideshead Revisited because it's so beautiful and funny and dark. Evelyn was as bad as I am. It's a very dark book, and I think everybody should read it.
I think you still have one left if you said 5.
Sorry, I have one left. Then I'm going to say, it's hard to choose. I'll say the other non-fantasy book that was a big influence for me, and that's Stanley by Virginia Woolf, who I started off talking about. I don't know that I've ever read a better novel than Mrs. Dalloway. I reread it every year. And I'll never write anything that good. And I get everybody to read it who I can. There you go, that's fine.
That's great. So not only you answered an extra question, you also gave us reading recommendations. We're very grateful. Lev Grossman, thank you so much for your availability and for your answers. I'm glad because you said things I didn't find in other interviews, so thank you so much for that. And we're looking forward to your next novel. Be sure you're going to pitch for it.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Mulțumim, am avut puține emoții, sper că m-am înțeles. Dar dacă erau alte întrebări, nu știu, poate le scriem, dacă v-au venit întrebări pe parcurs. Nu știm exact, sigur o să facem o pauză pe voară, nu știm exact cu cine o să deschidem seria din toamnă a seriilor Nautilus, dar o să vă anunțăm pe pagina noastră de Facebook. Mulțumim!